It is said that 3 a.m. is the most wicked time of all. The time when the night is the darkest and fear and hysteria sinks in the fastest. When the clock struck 3 a.m., my life took a turn for the worse. I had just arrived home from work. My throat was strained from yelling my lectures. I tell you, I never really realised how much I have to use my lungs when teaching in a large auditorium. But I digress. I removed my outdoor wear and walked towards the stairs when I heard a knock from upstairs. I stared up the staircase. There was no one there, just the plain old hall that led to the bathroom, the guest room and my room. I laughed the worry away and walked to my room. There I was greeted by my cat, Mouses. She was awake, but barely. I figured the sound was just her playing in the bathroom, as she often did. She gave a yawn and stared at me as I entered the room. I sat next to her on my bed and petted her gently. The strange thing is, she was looking in a very certain area. She was staring at the mirror on my nightstand. Curious, I glimpsed at the mirror. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it, but something about it struck me as off. I looked over at my clock. It read 2:45 a.m. I laughed. I must have spent quite a long time at the bar. Very suddenly, Moses stood up and bolted out of the room. I shrugged it off, thinking nothing of it. She always did have a hyper personality, like most young cats. I rested down next to a window and stared out, watching the cars pass by, watching people walk by. After a while, I stopped. Something wasn't normal. Something in my gut was telling me something was wrong. There was something about the reflection in the mirror that was a bit askew. I examined the mirror closely, and all I saw was a reflection of myself. Down the hall, I heard Mouses start to meow. Not a meow like I'm used to from her, but a low, harsh, painful bellow that sounded more like a hiss. Curious, I walked down the hall into the second room on the right, the guest room. She wasn't there. However, I did hear a crash from downstairs. I began down the steps, only to hear Mouses hiss once more. I caught a glimpse from the railings at Mouser. It was horrible. In fear, I ran to the bathroom and checked for Mouser. I opened the door and stepped inside. Mouser stopped her hissing and I turned on the light. Mouser's was just sitting on the sink counter. Her long grey fur looked mauled, and there was a look of pure pain and agony on her face. I stared in horror at what had become of my cat. I ran to grab her when the reflection in the mirror caught my eye. It was not of me, but a man who appeared sick and in awe. I couldn't believe my eyes. He seemed to reach out at me as if he wanted to tell me something. I reached my hand out and touched the mirror, mesmerised. I stood there for at least 3 minutes, gazing at the reflection, until I forced myself to concentrate on finding out what had happened to my cat. I shifted my vision to where I believe Moses had been, but she was gone, vanished without a trace. I looked back to the mirror and saw my same old reflection. Swallowing hard, I shook off the feelings of dread and left my bathroom. telling myself over and over that all I needed was sleep. Sleep would cure this. I was sure of it. I entered my room again and stood in the doorway. Suddenly, Mousers ran through my bedroom door. I entered the room and saw her, curling herself into a ball preparing for sleep. She looked pretty fine, much unlike what I had seen of her in the bathroom. I smiled and laughed off my previous notions of the horror. I must have just fallen asleep and dreamed the horror. I laid on the bed next to Mouser and closed my eyes. Out of the silence, I heard my front door slam shut. I went downstairs to inspect. What I saw surprised me. It was someone who looked just like me. I stared in horror at my doppelganger, watched it take off its coat, its scarf, placing its bag down where I normally would place mine. I ran downstairs and screamed at the top of my lungs at the doppelganger, only to realise it had vanished. Its scarf remained, its coat remained, but the being was gone. I began walking back up the stairs. The metallic rail felt cold and bitter against my chilling hands. My emotions darkened when I reached my room. There sat the doppelganger, petting Mousers. Rage filled me and I charged at the man, but to no avail. He just ignored me. I passed through him like nothing. I got up and sat at the window. Once Mousers had noticed me, she couldn't take her eyes off me. I knew she knew about this thing, and now I was desperate enough to ask her. Mousers, who is that thing? She stared at me like she was telling me that I was crazy. I laughed pitifully at myself. Here I was, once a great teacher, reduced to the level of a cat whisperer. The fall was so shocking, I began to cry. I stopped the tears and stood up. There was no use crying. I needed to figure out what was going on. I looked into the mirror on my headboard. The shock hit me. The doppelganger. It wasn't a doppelganger at all. It was me. I was in the mirrors, back in time, watching previous events go by. I sat on the bed, shocked, trying to comprehend what was happening when Mousers jumped up and ran. I wouldn't skip a beat this time. I sprung up and followed Mousers. She led me to my back door, which was busted open. I looked in the reflection on the floor tile to see the reflection of the blood. I reached down to touch it, wondering if it was real. I tapped the tile and brought my hand to my face. It was covered in blood. Then something fell onto the tile. I examined the reflection closely, soon realising it was the mangled body of Mousers, barely alive. I covered my mouth, shocked, trying to fight back the urge to vomit. I saw the mangled cat get up and start to hobble away as the murderer began to proceed. Now Mousers was gone, and I knew where she had gone. As fast as I could, I sprinted up the stairs to the bathroom, just as my other self entered. I saw myself panicking over the mangled Mouser. I saw myself just as before. I reached my hand out to the back of the mirror. My reflection turned to me and put his hand on the glass. Tears swelled in my eyes as I looked behind me to see the madman just out of view of my other's view. My astonishment turned to horror as the madman approached, brandishing a kitchen knife. I tried to yell at him and tell him to get out of the room, but he didn't listen to me. The madman raised his knife. I looked at the clock hanging behind me. The clock read 3 a.m.